I was nobody before I became her, a shadow behind a typewriter, pressing keys that spelled out other people's stories while my own remained unwritten. The advertisement appeared on a Tuesday morning, slipped beneath the door of the boarding house where I rented a narrow room that smelled of old soap and regret. Scientific volunteers needed for consciousness research, it read. Compensation provided, no experience necessary. I held the paper in my ink-stained fingers and felt something stir inside me that I had not felt in years. Hope, perhaps, or simply desperation, dressed in a more respectable coat. London in the autumn of 1893 was a city of fog and forgetting, where women like me disappeared into the machinery of progress without leaving so much as a fingerprint behind. I was 26 years old and had been typing legal documents for Messrs. Whitmore and Son for 5 years, my fingers flying across the keys with mechanical precision while my mind drifted to places I would never see and lives I would never live. The other typists spoke sometimes of beaux and engagements, of Sunday walks in the park and hopes for modest households of their own. But I had learned to keep silent. There was nothing in my small existence worth sharing, and I had grown accustomed to the peculiar loneliness of being surrounded by people who never truly saw me. The address on the advertisement led me to a townhouse in Bloomsbury, respectable but slightly faded, the kind of place where ambition had once lived but had since moved to more fashionable quarters. I climbed the steps on a Thursday evening after work, still wearing my plain gray dress and the cameo brooch that had belonged to my mother, the only pretty thing I owned. The door was opened by a severe-looking housekeeper who examined me with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to turning away the unworthy. But she stepped aside and directed me to the second-floor study. Dr. Ambrose Thorne was not what I expected. I had imagined someone elderly and professorial, dusty and distracted, but the man who rose from behind the cluttered desk was perhaps 40, tall and lean, with dark hair touched with silver at the temples and eyes of such unusual clarity that I felt seen for the first time in years. He wore a well-tailored waistcoat and shirt sleeves, his collar slightly loosened, and there was an intensity about him that filled the room like static electricity before a storm. He gestured for me to sit and studied me with an attention that made me acutely aware of my plain appearance, my chapped hands, the way my hair never quite stayed pinned as it should. "You are employed, Miss Hartley," he said, and I wondered how he knew my name before I remembered I had written it in my reply to the advertisement. I nodded and told him I was a typist. He seemed pleased by this. "Good," he said. "You understand precision, then. Documentation. The importance of accurate observation." I did not understand what typing had to do with consciousness research, but I did not say so. Instead, I listened as he explained his work in language that seemed designed both to illuminate and obscure. He spoke of the nature of dreams, of the relationship between mind and matter, of theories suggesting that consciousness was not fixed but fluid, capable of moving between states and perhaps even between vessels given the proper conditions and mechanisms. He had designed a machine, he said, that could induce a state of profound dreaming while maintaining a thread of lucidity, allowing the dreamer to explore realms of experience otherwise inaccessible to the waking mind. It sounded like something from a penny dreadful, the kind of lurid fiction I sometimes read in secret, but Dr. Thorne spoke with such conviction that I found myself leaning forward, drawn by the promise of escape from the gray repetition of my days. "What would I need to do?" I asked, and my voice sounded small in that book-lined room. He smiled then, and it transformed his face from severe to almost gentle. "You would simply sleep, Miss Hartley," he said, "and dream, and tell me what you see." The compensation was generous, more than I earned in a month of typing, and he needed volunteers for multiple sessions over the course of several weeks. There were forms to sign, dense with legal language that I skimmed without truly reading, too eager for the money and the novelty to care about the fine print. He asked me questions about my health, my family history, whether I had ever experienced unusual dreams or states of altered consciousness. I answered honestly. I was healthy, alone in the world since my parents' deaths, and my dreams were as ordinary and forgettable as everything else about me. He scheduled my first session for the following Tuesday evening. I was to arrive at 8 o'clock, having eaten lightly and abstained from alcohol and stimulants. I agreed to everything, signed where he indicated, and left the townhouse, feeling as though I had made some bargain, whose terms I did not fully understand, but whose promise gleamed with irresistible brightness. The days until Tuesday passed with agonizing slowness. I typed and filed and nodded at the appropriate moments during conversations I barely heard, my mind circling endlessly around the unknown experience awaiting me. I told no one about the experiment. The other typists would have thought me foolish or worse, and I had no friends close enough to confide in anyway. I was utterly alone with my anticipation, and there was a kind of terrible freedom in that. When Tuesday finally arrived, I left work precisely at 6, returned to my boarding house to wash and change into a clean shirtwaist and skirt, and made my way through the fog-thick streets to Bloomsbury. The housekeeper admitted me without comment and led me upstairs to a room I had not seen during my first visit. It was large and surprisingly warm, with heavy curtains drawn across the windows and a peculiar apparatus positioned beside a daybed upholstered in deep burgundy velvet. The machine was both more and less impressive than I had imagined. It consisted of a series of metal arms and glass chambers connected by rubber tubing, and a helmet-like device lined with what appeared to be copper filaments. Dr. Thorne was adjusting something on the mechanism as I entered, his sleeves rolled up and his expression absorbed. He looked up when I cleared my throat and smiled that transforming smile again. "Miss Hartley," he said, "punctual. Excellent. Are you ready to begin?" I was not ready, but I said yes anyway. He explained the process as he helped me recline on the daybed, his hands impersonal but gentle as he positioned pillows beneath my head and arranged a light blanket over me. The helmet would be placed over my head, he said, and I would inhale a mild sedative through a mouthpiece connected to one of the glass chambers. The sedative would ease me into sleep while the electrical components of the device stimulated specific regions of the brain associated with dreaming and memory. I would not be unconscious in the ordinary sense, but rather in a state of directed dreaming, and he would be monitoring the entire process from instruments positioned nearby. It sounded both scientific and absurd, but I had come too far to retreat. I nodded my understanding and watched as he lowered the helmet over my head. It was heavier than I expected, and the copper filaments pressed cool against my scalp. He placed the mouthpiece between my lips and told me to breathe normally, and I obeyed, tasting something faintly sweet and chemical on my tongue. The change came quickly. The room began to soften at the edges, the lamplight blurring into aureoles of gold, and Dr. Thorne's voice became distant and dreamlike as he spoke words I could not quite distinguish. I felt myself sinking, not into darkness, but into a kind of luminous gray space where sound and sensation seemed to arrive from very far away. I was aware of my body on the daybed and simultaneously aware of slipping free from it, like a hand withdrawing from a glove. Then there was a moment of absolute suspension, a breathless pause between one state and another, and I opened eyes that were not quite mine in a room I had never seen before. I was lying in a canopied bed hung with silk the color of midnight, and the ceiling above me was painted with cherubs and clouds in the Baroque style of a much grander era. My body felt different, heavier and lighter at once, and when I lifted my hand to my face, I saw that my fingers were long and white and unaccustomed to labor, adorned with rings that caught the morning light streaming through tall windows. I sat up, disoriented, and saw my reflection in a gilt-framed mirror across the room. The woman looking back at me was beautiful in a way I had never been and never could be. She had dark hair that fell in glossy waves over pale shoulders, a face of classical symmetry with high cheekbones, and a mouth made for both smiling and keeping secrets. She wore a nightgown of fine linen and lace, and her throat was encircled by a necklace of emeralds that must have cost more than I would earn in a lifetime. She was me and not me, familiar and utterly strange, and I understood with a shock that shivered through my borrowed bones that this was the dream Dr. Thorne's machine had given me. I rose from the bed, marveling at the feel of thick carpet beneath bare feet, at the weight of all that hair, at the easy grace with which this body moved. The room was enormous, furnished with pieces that spoke of wealth so old and established, it required no ostentation. A writing desk by the window, a wardrobe that could have housed a family, chairs upholstered in damask, and everywhere the scent of roses and something darker, heavier, like incense or expensive perfume. There was a soft knock at the door, and before I could respond, a young woman in a maid's uniform entered carrying a tray. "Good morning, Your Grace," she said, and I realized with a start that she was speaking to me. "I hope you slept well. Shall I prepare your bath, Your Grace?" The title hung in the air like a bell tone, and I understood that in this dream I was not Eleanor Hartley the typist, but someone else entirely. Someone who commanded servants and wore emeralds and slept in rooms painted with cherubs. I opened my mouth to correct her, to explain the mistake, but what emerged instead was a voice smooth and cultured and entirely assured. "Yes, thank you, Mary," I said, and the name came to me as if I had always known it. That would be lovely. The maid curtsied and disappeared through another door, and I stood in the center of that magnificent room trying to make sense of what was happening. This was a dream, I reminded myself, nothing more than the product of Dr. Thorne's machine and my own starved imagination. Yet it felt more real than any dream I had ever experienced. I could feel the morning chill, smell the roses, hear the distant sounds of a household awakening. When I touched the edge of the writing desk, the wood was solid beneath my fingers, cool and smooth and utterly convincing. I moved to the window and looked out at gardens that stretched toward a distant line of trees, all dressed in autumn colors that glowed in the slanting light. Somewhere below, I heard voices and the clatter of carriage wheels on gravel. This was an estate, I realized, a grand country house of the sort I had only ever glimpsed from train windows or read about in novels. And I was its mistress, addressed as Your Grace, which meant Duchess. I was a duchess in a dream, living a life as far removed from my own as the moon from the muddy streets of London. The thought should have delighted me, but instead I felt a creeping unease, a sense that something was not quite right beneath the surface of this beautiful fantasy. The feeling intensified when I caught sight of a newspaper folded on the breakfast tray the maid had left. I picked it up with hands that trembled slightly and saw my own face staring back at me from the front page. The headline made my heart stop. Duchess of Ashford questioned in suspicious death of houseguest. Society holds its breath. I read the article twice, my borrowed pulse pounding in my ears. It spoke of a man named Lord Edmund Fairfax, found dead in the library of this very house 3 nights ago, under circumstances that suggested neither accident nor natural causes. It spoke of myself, Vivian Ashford, Duchess of Ashford, widow of the late Duke, known for her beauty and her somewhat scandalous independence. It spoke of an investigation being conducted by Scotland Yard, led by a chief inspector named Nathaniel Cross, who had arrived at the estate 2 days ago and showed no signs of leaving. I was not merely a duchess in this dream. I was a duchess accused of murder. The newspaper slipped from my fingers, and I stood frozen, trying to reconcile the impossible information I had just absorbed. This could not be real. It was a dream, an elaborate fantasy spun by machinery and chemistry and my own unconscious mind. Yet it felt real in every particular, from the weight of the emeralds at my throat to the cold dread settling in my stomach. The door opened again, and the maid reappeared, her expression carefully neutral. "Begging your pardon, Your Grace," she said, "but the inspector has asked to speak with you at your earliest convenience. He is waiting in the morning room." The inspector, Chief Inspector Nathaniel Cross, who believed I might be a murderer. I wanted to tell the maid that there had been a mistake, that I was not the Duchess, that I was only a typist from London who had volunteered for an experiment and somehow ended up trapped in someone else's nightmare. But the words would not come, and I realized with a strange sort of resignation that I had no choice but to play the role assigned to me. "Very well," I heard myself say. "Tell the inspector I will join him shortly. And Mary, please lay out something appropriate for receiving officials." The maid curtsied and withdrew, and I was left alone with my reflection and the terrible knowledge that I was about to meet the man who suspected me of murder. And I had no idea whether I was guilty or innocent, real or imagined, Eleanor or Vivienne, awake or dreaming. I only knew that when I thought of facing this inspector, this Nathaniel Cross who was hunting a killer in a house where I did not belong, my heart beat faster with something that felt dangerously like anticipation. The dress Mary laid out was midnight blue silk with jet beading at the collar and cuffs. elegant and somber enough for a woman whose houseguest had recently died under suspicious circumstances. As she fastened the long row of buttons down my back, I caught glimpses of myself in the mirror and saw a stranger wearing my face. Or perhaps I was the stranger wearing hers. The distinction seemed to matter less with each passing moment. My hands knew how to arrange the folds of the skirt without conscious thought. My feet navigated the corridors of the house as if they had walked them 1,000 times before, down a wide staircase with banisters carved from dark wood, past portraits of stern-faced ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow my progress, through halls where servants stepped aside and dropped their gazes as I passed. I was moving through someone else's life with someone else's body, and yet it all felt terrifyingly natural, as though Eleanor Hartley the typist had been the dream, and this had always been the reality. The morning room was bright with autumn sunlight that streamed through tall windows overlooking the garden. A fire crackled in the marble fireplace, and the air smelled of coffee and wood smoke and something else, something sharp and masculine that I identified a moment later as tobacco. A man stood at the window with his back to me, his posture suggesting controlled tension, and when he turned at the sound of my entrance, I felt my breath catch in a way that had nothing to do with fear. Chief Inspector Nathaniel Cross was perhaps 35, with the kind of face that would have been handsome if it were not so severe. His features were angular and uncompromising, his mouth set in a line that suggested he smiled rarely and laughed even less. His eyes were gray, the color of winter skies, and they held an intelligence that seemed to strip away pretense and see directly to the truth beneath. He wore a dark suit of good, but not extravagant quality, and there was a weariness about him that spoke of too many late nights and too many cases that ended badly. He did not bow. He simply looked at me with those penetrating eyes and said, "Your Grace, thank you for seeing me. I trust I have not called at an inconvenient hour." His voice was deep and carefully modulated, with the accent of a man who had been born to modest circumstances and educated himself beyond them. There was no warmth in it, but there was a kind of rough courtesy, as though he understood the forms of society, even if he did not believe in them. I moved into the room with what I hoped was appropriate dignity and took a seat in one of the upholstered chairs near the fire. Mary had coached me silently through gestures and glances, and I found myself mimicking behaviors I had only read about in novels. The inspector remained standing, a subtle assertion of authority that was not lost on me. "Not at all, Inspector," I said, and marveled again at how easily this cultured voice emerged from my throat. "I am at your disposal. I understand you wish to ask me about Lord Fairfax." He studied me for a long moment, and I had the uncomfortable sensation of being assessed and catalogued, every detail noted and filed away for future reference. "Yes," he said finally, "I have been reviewing the circumstances of his death, and there are certain inconsistencies that require clarification. I hope you will forgive the indelicacy of my questions." I inclined my head, my heart beating fast beneath the jet beating. He moved closer, not quite looming, but near enough that I could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the shadow of stubble along his jaw. He produced a small notebook from his coat pocket and consulted it briefly before meeting my gaze again. "Lord Fairfax arrived at Ashford House 4 days ago," he said. "Is that correct?" "Yes. He was an old friend of my late husband. He had written requesting an invitation, and I saw no reason to refuse." The inspector made a note. "And during his visit, did you observe anything unusual about his behavior or state of mind?" I hesitated, not because I lacked an answer, but because the answer was already present in my mind, complete and detailed, as though I had lived through the events he was asking about. Lord Fairfax had been agitated, I heard myself say, distracted. He mentioned that he had business matters weighing on his mind, but he did not elaborate, and I did not press him. We were not intimate friends, Inspector. His relationship was with my husband, not with me. Cross made another note, his expression revealing nothing. "On the evening of his death, you hosted a dinner party. Several guests from the neighborhood attended. Can you describe the events of that evening?" Again, the memories arrived unbidden, vivid and seemingly authentic. I described the dinner, the guests, the conversation that had ranged over politics and literature, and the latest scandals from London. I described how Lord Fairfax had excused himself early, claiming a headache, and how I had not seen him again until the butler discovered his body in the library the following morning. The inspector listened without interruption, his gray eyes never leaving my face, and I had the sense that he was looking for something specific, some telltale sign of guilt or deception. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and in that silence, I became acutely aware of how alone we were, how the morning light made his face look both harder and somehow more vulnerable, how the air between us seemed charged with unspoken tensions that had nothing to do with his investigation. "You were the last person to see Lord Fairfax alive," he said at last. "Apart from his killer, of course, if indeed he was killed and did not die of natural causes." I felt cold despite the fire. "Are you suggesting that he was murdered, Inspector?" "I am suggesting that a man in apparent good health does not simply collapse and die in a locked library without cause. The physician who examined the body noted certain anomalies: dilated pupils, discoloration of the lips, signs consistent with poisoning, though he could not identify the specific agent without further analysis. The word poisoning hung between us like an accusation. I folded my hands in my lap to keep them from trembling and met his gaze as steadily as I could. "And you believe I might have administered this poison?" For the first time, something flickered in those winter-gray eyes, something that might have been doubt or perhaps reluctant admiration. "I believe you are a woman of considerable intelligence and self-possession, Your Grace. I believe you are accustomed to managing difficult situations with skill. And I believe you are concealing something, though I have not yet determined what." His bluntness should have offended me, but instead I felt a strange thrill of recognition, as though he had seen something true about me that I had not yet acknowledged myself. "I am concealing nothing, Inspector," I said, and knew even as I spoke that it was a lie, though I could not have said what truth I was hiding. If Lord Fairfax was murdered, I had no hand in it. I barely knew the man. "Yet he came here," Cross said, leaning forward slightly. "He traveled 2 days from London to visit you specifically, not merely the estate where he once knew your husband. Why? I do not know. Perhaps he wished to discuss matters related to my husband's affairs. Perhaps he simply desired country air and familiar surroundings. You would have to ask him, and as he is dead, that is no longer possible." The inspector's mouth tightened, and I saw frustration cross his features before he controlled it. He straightened and closed his notebook with a decisive snap. "I will need to search Lord Fairfax's rooms," he said, "and I will need to speak with your servants. I trust you have no objection." "None whatsoever. I want the truth discovered as much as you do, Inspector." He looked at me again with that penetrating gaze, and I felt as though he could see straight through the silk dress and the emeralds and the Duchess facade to the frightened typist beneath. "Do you?" he said softly. "I wonder." Then he bowed, correct and formal, and left the room, and I sat alone by the fire trying to understand what had just happened. The encounter had felt like a duel fought with words instead of weapons, and I could not say which of us had won. What I could say, what I knew with uncomfortable certainty, was that Nathaniel Cross disturbed me in ways that had nothing to do with his suspicions and everything to do with the way his eyes had lingered on my face, the way his voice had softened when he said "I wonder," the way I had wanted, inexplicably and inappropriately, for him to stay. I spent the rest of the morning in a daze, moving through the house like a ghost in my own dream. Servants came and went, speaking to me of household matters that I responded to with answers that seemed to arrive from some deep reservoir of knowledge I should not possess. I approved menus and reviewed accounts and discussed the needs of the estate with the housekeeper. And all the while I felt like an actress performing a role she had only just learned. Vivian. The name echoed in my mind. Vivian Ashford, Duchess of Ashford, widow and possible murderess. Who was she? Who had she been before I woke in her bed wearing her body and her guilt? And where was Eleanor Hartley in all of this? Was I still sleeping on Dr. Thorne's daybed in Bloomsbury, my brain stimulated by electrical currents and my dreams given shape by some mechanism I did not understand? Or had something gone wrong, some slippage between the waking world and this one, leaving me stranded in a reality that should not exist? I found myself drawn to the library where Lord Fairfax had died, as though proximity to the scene might reveal some clue to my predicament. It was a grand room lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes, with tall windows that overlooked the grounds and a massive desk positioned to catch the afternoon light. The air still held a faint medicinal smell, and there was a dark stain on the carpet near one of the reading chairs that made my stomach turn. I was standing there, trying to imagine what had happened in this room 3 nights ago, when I heard footsteps behind me and turned to find the inspector in the doorway. He looked surprised to see me, and something else, something that might have been concern. "Forgive me, Your Grace," he said. "I did not mean to disturb you. I was conducting my search of the premises." I shook my head, suddenly weary of pretense. "You are not disturbing me, Inspector. I came here because I needed to see it, the place where he died. I cannot explain why." He moved into the room, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet, and stood beside me, looking at the stained chair. "It is natural to seek understanding," he said quietly, "especially when understanding is denied us. Death is always a mystery, even when the cause is clear." There was something in his tone, a quality of personal sorrow that made me look at him more closely. "Have you lost someone, Inspector? Is that why you became a policeman?" He glanced at me sharply, as though I had touched something tender and unexpected. "My sister," he said after a pause, "many years ago. She was killed by a man who was never brought to justice. I suppose I have been trying to balance those scales ever since." The confession hung between us, intimate and unexpected, and I felt something shift in the air, some barrier lowering. "I am sorry," I said softly. "That is a terrible burden to carry. We all carry burdens, Your Grace. Some are simply more visible than others." He moved to the desk and began examining the papers scattered across its surface, but I could feel his awareness of me as acutely as I felt my own awareness of him. There was something building between us, some current of attraction and suspicion and recognition that made the large room feel suddenly small and warm. "Inspector," I said, and he looked up, "do you truly believe I killed Lord Fairfax?" He was silent for a long moment, his gray eyes searching my face. "I believe you are hiding something," he said finally. "But whether that something is murder or merely the secrets we all keep to survive in society, I cannot yet say. You intrigue me, Your Grace. That is both a compliment and a confession that I should not make." My heart was beating very fast now. "Why should you not make it?" "Because I am here to investigate a possible crime, not to become entangled with a suspect, however compelling I might find her." The word compelling seemed to echo in the quiet library, and I saw him realize what he had admitted. Color rose in his face, and he looked away, his jaw tightening. "Forgive me," he said stiffly. "That was inappropriate." "Was it?" I moved closer, drawn by an impulse I did not fully understand. "Perhaps we are both searching for truth, Inspector. Perhaps we might search more effectively if we were not adversaries." He looked at me then, with an expression so complex I could not begin to untangle it. Desire and duty, suspicion and fascination, all warring across his austere features. "We cannot be anything but adversaries, Your Grace," he said quietly. "Not while Lord Fairfax's death remains unexplained, not while you remain a person of interest in my investigation." But his eyes told a different story, and when his gaze dropped to my mouth and lingered there for a heartbeat too long, I knew that he felt the pull between us as strongly as I did. The moment broke when a servant appeared at the door to announce that luncheon was ready. The inspector stepped back, formal and controlled once more, and bowed. "I will continue my investigation," he said. "With your permission, I will remain at the estate until I have satisfied myself as to the truth." "Of course, Inspector. Ashford House is at your disposal." He left without another word, and I stood alone in the library, where a man had died, and wondered what truth either of us would find at the end of this strange and terrible dream, and whether that truth would destroy us both, or somehow, impossibly, set us free. Because I was beginning to suspect that the greatest mystery at Ashford House was not how Lord Fairfax had died, but who I truly was, and whether the woman the inspector was learning to desire was Eleanor Hartley wearing a duchess-like a costume, or Vivian Ashford wearing Eleanor Hartley's confusion like a disguise, or something else entirely, some third and more frightening possibility that I did not yet have the courage to name. The dreams began that night, dreams within the dream, and I could no longer tell where one reality ended and another began. I lay in the canopied bed in darkness, so complete it felt like drowning, and somewhere in that blackness I heard a voice calling a name. Eleanor. Eleanor, wake up. It was Dr. Thorne's voice, distant and distorted as though traveling through deep water, and I tried to respond, but my mouth would not form the words. I reached toward the sound and felt my hand pass through something cold and insubstantial. And then I was falling, tumbling through layers of consciousness like a stone dropping through silk. When I opened my eyes, I was still in the bed at Ashford House, still wearing the fine linen nightgown, still surrounded by luxury and shadows. But something had changed. The room felt heavier, older, as though time had thickened around me. I rose and moved to the window and saw that the gardens were different now, wilder and more overgrown, and the sky held a strange purple quality that belonged to no natural dawn. A figure stood beneath the trees at the edge of the lawn. Even from this distance I recognized Lord Fairfax, though I had never met him in life, only inherited the Duchess's memories of him. He was looking up at the house, at my window, and his face was pale and accusatory. I pressed my hand to the cold glass and felt my breath fog the pain, and when I blinked, he was gone. I woke again, truly woke this time, to find pale morning light seeping through the curtains and Mary entering with a breakfast tray. The normality of the scene should have been reassuring, but instead, I felt unmoored, uncertain which waking was real and which was merely another layer of Dr. Thorne's experiment. How many days had I been here? Time seemed to slip and fold, impossible to measure. In the life I remembered, I had entered the townhouse in Bloomsbury only yesterday evening, but here I had lived through what felt like several days, accumulating memories and emotions that belonged to someone else. Your Grace, Mary said softly, setting the tray on the bedside table. Are you quite well? You look pale. I managed a smile that felt brittle on my lips. I did not sleep soundly. Bad dreams. She nodded sympathetically and moved to open the curtains, flooding the room with autumn brightness that hurt my eyes. The inspector sent word that he would like to speak with you again this afternoon, she said. And Lady Pemberton has called. She is waiting in the drawing room. Lady Pemberton. The name meant nothing to Eleanor Hartley, but to Vivian Ashford it conjured an immediate and complex response. Margaret Pemberton, neighbor and friend, society matron and relentless gossip, a woman who collected secrets the way others collected china figurines. I felt Vivian's wariness and Eleanor's curiosity blend into something uncomfortable. Tell Lady Pemberton I will join her shortly, I said. And Mary, has the inspector made any progress in his investigation? The maid's expression became guarded. I could not say, Your Grace. He has been very thorough. He questioned all the servants yesterday. Cook was quite upset. What did he ask about? About Lord Fairfax's visit, about his habits and who attended to him, about the dinner party that last evening. He seemed particularly interested in what Lord Fairfax ate and drank. Poison. The inspector was building his case around poison, trying to trace the means and opportunity. I nodded and dismissed Mary, then rose to dress myself in a morning gown of dove gray that seemed appropriate for a woman whose reputation hung by a thread. Lady Pemberton was ensconced in the drawing room like a general surveying a battlefield, her ample figure swathed in plum-colored silk, her sharp eyes missing nothing. She rose as I entered and embraced me with a fervor that seemed calculated to demonstrate public support, while her gaze catalogued every detail of my appearance for later dissection. Vivienne, my dear, she said, her voice rich with false warmth. How dreadful all this must be for you. The whole county is talking of nothing else. I felt I must call and offer my support in your hour of trial. How kind of you, Margaret, I said, taking a seat and gesturing for her to do the same. I appreciate your concern. She settled herself with a rustle of silk and leaned forward conspiratorially. I must tell you, there are the most appalling rumors circulating. People are saying that Lord Fairfax was poisoned, that Scotland Yard believes it was murder. They are saying that you and he had some sort of understanding, that his death was not altogether unexpected in certain quarters. The accusation was wrapped in concern, but it was an accusation nonetheless. I felt anger rise in my chest, clean and clarifying. I had no understanding with Lord Fairfax, I said coolly. He was a guest in my home, nothing more. If he was murdered, I am as shocked and horrified as anyone." Lady Pemberton's eyes gleamed. "Of course, my dear. I did not for a moment believe otherwise. But you must understand how it looks. A widow, still young and beautiful, living alone in this great house. A gentleman visitor who dies under mysterious circumstances. That handsome inspector asking questions. Society will draw conclusions, fair or not. Let them draw what conclusions they like. I know the truth, and so does the inspector when his investigation is complete." "Ah, yes, the inspector." She sat back with a satisfied smile. "Chief Inspector Cross. Quite striking in his way, is he not? All that intensity and moral certainty. I understand he has quite a reputation for solving difficult cases, and for being incorruptible, which must be terribly inconvenient for those with something to hide." "I have nothing to hide," I said. But even as I spoke, I felt the lie of it. I was nothing but hiding, a woman hiding inside another woman, a typist hiding inside a duchess, Eleanor hiding inside Vivian, layer upon layer of deception that I myself could not fully penetrate. Lady Pemberton stayed for an hour, probing delicately at my defenses, offering sympathy and spreading poison with equal skill. When she finally departed, I felt exhausted and somehow soiled, as though her suspicions had left a residue on my skin. I understood now why Vivian moved in society with such careful reserve. These people were not friends, but competitors, always watching for weakness, always ready to exploit any advantage. I retreated to the conservatory, a glass-walled room filled with plants and the smell of damp earth, seeking solace in green things that asked nothing and judged nothing. I was examining an orchid when I heard footsteps behind me and turned to find Inspector Cross standing in the doorway. He looked tired, I thought, and there were shadows beneath his eyes that suggested he had slept no better than I had. But there was also a kind of determination in his bearing, as though he had reached some decision during the night and meant to see it through regardless of cost. "Your Grace," he said, "forgive the intrusion. I was told I might find you here. You are not intruding, Inspector. Have you come to arrest me?" The question was half jest, half genuine inquiry, and I saw his mouth tighten. "Not yet," he said, "but I have come to ask you something, and I would appreciate an honest answer if you can give one." "I will try." He moved closer, his boots echoing on the tiled floor, until he stood near enough that I could smell the faint scent of shaving soap and tobacco that clung to him. "Who was Lord Fairfax to you, truly? Not what you told me before, but the truth beneath the polite fiction." I felt something tighten in my chest. "I told you the truth. He was my husband's friend." The inspector shook his head slowly. "I have been reading through Lord Fairfax's papers. I have been speaking to people who knew him in London, and I have discovered that in the 6 months before his death, he withdrew a substantial sum of money from his accounts, money that cannot be accounted for. Money that disappeared into nothing, or more likely into someone's pocket. Are you suggesting he was paying me? I am suggesting that he was paying someone, and that someone might have had reason to want him silenced. The implication hung between us, ugly and impossible to ignore. I felt Vivian's outrage and Eleanor's confusion blend into something sharp and painful. "I was not being paid by Lord Fairfax," I said clearly. "I have no need of money, Inspector. My husband left me very well provided for. Then what was he doing here? What did he want from you?" The answer rose in my mind unbidden, a memory that was not mine, but felt true nonetheless. "He wanted to unburden himself," I said slowly. "He was dying, Inspector. Not by poison, but by a cancer that was eating him from within. He had perhaps 6 months to live, and he knew it. He came here because he wanted to confess something to someone who had known my husband, something that had been weighing on his conscience." Cross went very still. "What did he want to confess?" "I do not know. He died before he could tell me." The inspector studied my face for a long moment, and I saw doubt and belief warring in his expression. "That is a convenient story, Your Grace. It is the truth, or at least, it is what I believe to be the truth. I am as much in the dark as you are, Inspector. Perhaps more so." Something in my voice must have convinced him because his expression softened fractionally. "Tell me about your husband," he said. "The late Duke. What manner of man was he? I felt Vivien's memories rise like a tide, bitter and complex. He was a man of position and pride, I said carefully. A man who valued his reputation above all else. He was not unkind to me, but neither was he warm. Ours was an arranged marriage, Inspector. I brought money and connections. He brought a title and respectability. We were companions, not lovers. And when he died, I felt relief. Is that so terrible to admit? Cross shook his head. No, he said quietly. It is human, but it gives you a motive, does it not? If Lord Fairfax knew something about your husband, something that might damage your newfound freedom or your reputation, you might have had reason to silence him. I might have, I agreed. But I did not. I swear to you, Inspector, I did not kill Lord Fairfax. Whatever he came here to tell me died with him, and I'm as frustrated by that loss as you are. He was standing very close now, close enough that I could see the flecks of darker gray in his eyes, the faint scar above his left eyebrow. There was a tension between us that had nothing to do with murder and everything to do with the dangerous attraction that seemed to grow stronger each time we met. I want to believe you, he said, and his voice was rough, almost pained. God help me, I want to believe you, but I cannot let my judgment be clouded by what I feel. And what do you feel, Inspector? The question was reckless, but I had to know. I had to hear him say it, to confirm that the current running between us was not merely my imagination or some artifact of this strange dream. He reached out and touched my face, his fingers gentle against my cheek, and I felt a shock run through me at the contact. I feel that you are the most dangerous woman I have ever met, he said softly. Dangerous to my investigation, dangerous to my peace of mind, dangerous to my heart. I feel that I am betraying everything I believe in by standing here, wanting to kiss you when I should be placing you under arrest. Then why do you not arrest me? Because I am not certain of your guilt, and because I am a fool. He leaned closer, and I thought he truly would kiss me, but at the last moment he pulled back, his control reasserting itself. Forgive me, he said, stepping away. That was unconscionable. I will take my leave. Wait, I said, catching his arm. Inspector, please. If you believe I am innocent, help me prove it. Help me discover what Lord Fairfax wanted to tell me, because I think that secret, whatever it is the key to everything. He looked down at where my hand rested on his sleeve, and I saw the conflict in his face. If I do this, he said slowly, if I trust you, and I discover you have deceived me, it will destroy me. Do you understand that? I understand. And I promise you, I am not deceiving you. Not about this. He covered my hand with his, warm and solid and real. Very well, he said. We will search for the truth together. But I warn you, Your Grace, the truth is rarely what we hope it will be. He left me then, and I stood alone among the orchids, feeling as though I had crossed some invisible line from which there would be no return. I was bound to this man now, this austere inspector with his gray eyes and his wounded past, bound by attraction and necessity, and something deeper that I was afraid to name. That night, I dreamed again of Dr. Thorne's voice calling me back to myself, and I tried with all my strength to follow it, to climb out of Vivien's life and return to Eleanor's. But the threads that connected me to my old existence seemed to fray and break even as I reached for them. And when I woke in the darkness, I could not remember what Eleanor Hartley's room in the boarding house looked like, could not recall the faces of the other typists or the smell of ink and paper that had been the fabric of my days. I was forgetting who I had been, and I was terrified that if I forgot completely, I would be trapped in this dream forever, condemned to live out Vivien's life and love Vivien's inspector and die Vivien's death, while the real Eleanor Hartley slept on in Bloomsbury, lost in a machine that could not bring her home. The breakthrough came 3 days later, hidden in a place so obvious we had both overlooked it. Inspector Cross and I had fallen into an uneasy partnership, meeting each evening in the library after the household had retired, reviewing Lord Fairfax's papers and correspondence by lamplight while the fire burned low and the autumn wind rattled the windows. It was dangerous and improper. A widow and an unmarried man alone together in the intimacy of shared purpose, but propriety seemed a small concern weighed against the need for truth. I had grown to know him in those quiet hours. I learned that he took his tea without sugar, that he had a habit of running his hand through his hair when frustrated, that his stern exterior concealed a dry wit and an unexpected capacity for gentleness. He spoke sometimes of his sister, the girl whose murder had set him on this path, and I understood that he was seeking not just justice for Lord Fairfax, but some kind of redemption for all the cases he had failed to solve, all the victims he had not been able to save. And he was learning me, or learning Vivian, the distinction between us growing ever more blurred. He watched me with those penetrating gray eyes as I moved about the library, and I felt his attention like a physical touch. We were careful not to be alone together for too long, careful not to let our hands brush when passing documents, careful to maintain the fiction that this was merely an investigation and not something deeper and more perilous. But the tension between us grew with each passing evening, a current that hummed beneath every conversation, every shared glance, every moment of accidental proximity. I found myself thinking of him at odd hours, remembering the timbre of his voice, the line of his jaw, the way his face softened when he allowed himself to smile. And I saw in his eyes that he was engaged in the same dangerous battle, trying to reconcile his duty with his desire, his suspicion with his growing conviction of my innocence. It was on the fourth night of our collaboration that I noticed the book. We had been searching Lord Fairfax's belongings repeatedly, but this time I approached his small traveling trunk from a different angle, and the lamplight fell differently across the contents. There, wedged in the lining at the bottom, was a slim volume bound in red leather. I lifted it out carefully and saw that it was a journal, its pages filled with Lord Fairfax's cramped handwriting. "Inspector," I said quietly, and something in my voice made him look up from the papers he had been studying. "I think I have found something." He came to stand beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him, and together we opened the journal and began to read. The entries were fragmentary, some merely dates and names, others longer passages that suggested a mind in turmoil. But gradually, a story emerged, a terrible story of secrets and lies that reached back decades. Lord Fairfax had been tormented by guilt, haunted by something he and the late Duke had done together when they were young men, some crime or betrayal that had never been discovered but had poisoned both their lives. The entries referenced a girl named Catherine Marsh, the daughter of a tenant farmer on one of the Duke's estates. She had been 17, beautiful and innocent, and both young men had pursued her. The details were vague, obscured by euphemism and deliberate omission, but the implication was clear enough. Something had happened to Catherine Marsh, something that had ended her life or destroyed it, and Lord Fairfax and the Duke had conspired to conceal their involvement. I felt sick reading it, felt Vivian's horror and Eleanor's confusion blend into a nauseating whole. The Duke I had never known, but whose memories I carried, had been involved in something monstrous, and Lord Fairfax had come to Ashford House not to confess to me, but to confess to the ghost of his accomplice, to unburden himself in the place where they had once been young and careless and cruel. Cross read over my shoulder in grim silence, and when we reached the final entry, dated 2 days before Lord Fairfax's death, his hand tightened on the edge of the table. The passage read, "I cannot bear it any longer. The knowledge of what we did has eaten at me like a cancer, far more deadly than the one consuming my body. I must tell someone. I must make amends while I still can. Tomorrow I will speak to the Duchess. Perhaps she will understand. Perhaps she will help me find Catherine's family and make what restitution I can. Or perhaps she will despise me as I have come to despise myself." So he had meant to confess, I said slowly. He had meant to tell me everything, but he died before he could. Cross closed the journal carefully, his face unreadable. "This gives us motive," he said. "If someone knew what he intended to reveal, if someone feared the scandal that would follow, they might have killed him to protect that secret. But who? Lord Fairfax and my husband were both involved. My husband is dead. Who else would have reason to fear this confession?" The inspector met my eyes, and I saw the pieces falling into place in his mind. "Your husband's family," he said. "His mother, the Dowager Duchess. His brother, if he has one. Anyone whose reputation or inheritance might be damaged by the revelation that the Duke was involved in the death or ruin of a tenant's daughter." I thought of the portraits lining the halls, the stern faces of Ashford ancestors who had valued honor and position above all else. The Dowager Duchess lived in the London townhouse and had not spoken to me since the funeral, disapproving of my independence and my refusal to wear black for longer than convention demanded. The Duke's younger brother Edmund was a member of Parliament, ambitious and image-conscious. Either of them might have learned of Lord Fairfax's intentions. Either of them might have acted to prevent the confession. "We must find out what happened to Catherine Marsh," I said. "If she is alive, she deserves to know that Lord Fairfax felt remorse. If she is dead, she deserves justice, even if it comes decades too late." Cross nodded slowly. "I will make inquiries. The estate records should contain information about tenant families from that period, and I will need to interview the Dowager Duchess and the current heir. Be careful, Inspector. If one of them is a murderer, you will be putting yourself in danger." He smiled then, a quick flash of warmth that transformed his austere face. "I am always careful, Your Grace. It is my nature, but I thank you for your concern." Our eyes met and held, and in that moment, I felt the full force of what was building between us. It was more than attraction, more than the dangerous thrill of forbidden desire. It was recognition, the sense of having found someone who saw me truly, who challenged and understood me in equal measure. I wanted to reach out and touch his face, to close the small distance between us, and discover whether his mouth was as stern as it appeared or whether it would soften under mine. But I did not. I stepped back instead, breaking the spell, and he did the same, his expression closing like a door. "We should retire," he said formally. "It is late, and we both need rest. I will begin my inquiries in the morning." I nodded, not trusting my voice, and watched him leave the library with his characteristic controlled stride. When he was gone, I sank into one of the reading chairs and pressed my hands to my face, trying to steady my breathing and slow my racing heart. I was in love with him. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. I loved Nathaniel Cross with an intensity that Eleanor Hartley had never felt for anyone, a love that consumed and transformed and demanded everything. But I did not know if I was truly Vivian loving him or Eleanor wearing Vivian's emotions like borrowed clothes. I did not know if this love was real or merely another artifact of the dream, a story I was living instead of writing. And I did not know what would happen when the truth was finally revealed, when the investigation concluded and the murderer was caught. Would I wake in Dr. Thorne's townhouse, my brief time as a duchess nothing but a fading memory? Or would I remain trapped in this life, in this love, in this impossible situation from which there seemed no escape? The dreams that night were worse than ever. I saw Catherine Marsh, though I had no way of knowing what she truly looked like, a girl with dark hair and frightened eyes, running through the woods while two young men pursued her with intentions that made my stomach turn. I saw the late Duke, not as the portrait in the hall depicted him, but as he must have been in youth, handsome and cruel, and utterly without conscience. I saw Lord Fairfax standing over a grave with tears streaming down his face, and I knew somehow that it was Catherine's grave, hidden somewhere on the estate where no one would think to look. And I saw Dr. Thorne leaning over me as I lay on his daybed, his face twisted with concern, and something else, something that looked like guilt or fear. "Eleanor," he was saying, "Eleanor, you must wake up. Something has gone wrong with the machine. You are not supposed to be this deep. Please, Eleanor, come back." I tried to respond, tried to tell him I could hear him, but could not find my way back. But my mouth would not form words, and my body would not obey. I was trapped between worlds, suspended in a dream that had become more real than reality, and I could feel myself slipping further away with each passing moment. Feel Eleanor Hartley dissolving like salt in water, while Vivian Ashford grew more solid and substantial. When I woke, it was to Mary's gentle voice and the gray light of another autumn morning. But something had changed. My memories of the boarding house, of the typewriter and the legal documents, and my former life were vague now, distant as childhood. What felt real was this: the canopied bed and the emerald necklace, and the inspector with his gray eyes and his wounded heart. I rose and dressed with hands that no longer trembled, and when I looked in the mirror, I saw only Vivian looking back. Eleanor, if she existed at all, was a ghost haunting the edges of my consciousness, a whisper I could no longer quite hear. Cross returned in the afternoon with news that drained the color from my face. He had found records of Catherine Marsh in the estate archives. She had disappeared in the summer of 1868, the same year the Duke and Lord Fairfax had both been 22. There had been a brief search, but the matter had been quietly dropped when the girl's father accepted a sum of money and moved his family to America. The implication was clear. The Duke had paid for the father's silence, had bought permission to bury whatever crime had been committed against Catherine. But there was more. Cross had interviewed several elderly servants who had been at Ashford House during that long-ago summer, and one of them, a former groundskeeper now living in the village, remembered something. He remembered seeing young Edmund Ashford, the Duke's younger brother, arguing violently with Catherine Marsh near the edge of the woods. He remembered the girl's dress was torn, her face bruised, and he remembered being told by the estate manager never to speak of it on pain of losing his position and his pension. Edmund Ashford, the current heir, the Member of Parliament, the man who stood to inherit everything if I could be convicted of murder and removed from Ashford House. He had been there that summer. He had been involved somehow in whatever happened to Catherine Marsh, and he had the most to lose if Lord Fairfax's confession became public. We must confront him, I said. We must make him tell us the truth. Cross shook his head. We have no proof, only the testimony of an old man about events that happened 25 years ago. Edmund Ashford will deny everything, and we will have accomplished nothing except warning him that we are close to the truth. Then what do? We set a trap, the inspector said quietly. We let him think we have found proof. We make him believe that Lord Fairfax left a full written confession detailing Edmund's involvement in Catherine Marsh's death, and we wait for him to reveal himself. It was a dangerous plan, one that required me to play the role of bait, but I agreed without hesitation. I had come too far, invested too much of myself in this investigation and in the man conducting it, to turn back now. If Edmund Ashford was a murderer, he would answer for his crimes, and if confronting him meant risking my own life, then that was a risk I would take, because I realized, with a clarity that was almost painful, that I no longer cared whether I was Eleanor or Vivian, whether this was a dream or reality. What I cared about was standing beside Nathaniel Cross and seeing justice done, was proving my innocence and earning his trust, was building something real and true in the midst of all these lies. I loved him. And that love, whatever its origin, was the only thing that felt solid in a world that shifted like smoke beneath my feet. Edmund Ashford arrived at the estate 2 days later, responding to the telegram I had sent, claiming I needed to discuss urgent family matters. He came in a hired carriage, impeccably dressed and radiating the smooth confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way through charm and position. He was handsome in the way the late Duke had been handsome, with the same aristocratic features and air of entitlement. But where my husband had been cold, Edmund was warm, greeting me with a kiss on the cheek and expressions of concern for my welfare that rang utterly false to my ears. Inspector Cross had positioned himself in the study adjoining the drawing room, watching through a gap in the door that was barely visible unless you knew to look for it. We had agreed on signals, on the questions I would ask, on the moment when he would reveal himself if Edmund's response warranted intervention. My heart beat fast beneath my composed exterior, but my hands were steady as I poured tea and offered Edmund a seat by the fire. He accepted with easy grace and spent several minutes discussing London gossip and parliamentary business, clearly in no hurry to address the reason for his visit. I let him talk, watching him carefully, trying to see past the polished surface to the man beneath. This was the boy who had argued with Catherine Marsh in the woods, who had perhaps done far worse. This was the man who might have poisoned Lord Fairfax to protect a decades-old secret. Finally, he set down his teacup and looked at me with an expression of studied concern. You mentioned urgent family matters in your telegram, Vivian. I confess, I am curious. What could be so pressing that it required my immediate presence? I met his gaze steadily. Lord Fairfax's death, I said, and what it has revealed about our family's past. Something flickered in his eyes, too quick to identify, but his smile never wavered. A tragic accident, he said smoothly. or so I understood. Surely the inspector has concluded his investigation by now. The inspector believes Lord Fairfax was murdered. And before his death, he left certain documents that cast a rather ugly light on events that occurred here 25 years ago. Events involving a girl named Catherine Marsh. The change in Edmund was subtle, but unmistakable. His posture stiffened slightly, and his hands, which had been relaxed on the arms of his chair, tightened into fists. "I see," he said after a pause. "And what do these alleged documents contain?" "A full confession. Lord Fairfax detailed everything that happened that summer. What you and your brother did to Catherine Marsh. How you silenced her family with money. How you have all lived with that secret ever since. It was a bluff, a careful construction of truth and invention, but Edmund could not know that. He stood abruptly and moved to the window, his back to me, his shoulders rigid. "My brother is dead," he said flatly. "He cannot defend himself against such accusations. And Lord Fairfax was dying of cancer, his mind likely affected by pain and medication. Nothing he wrote can be considered reliable. So you deny it? You deny that Catherine Marsh existed? That something terrible happened to her?" He turned to face me, and all pretense of warmth had vanished from his expression. "I deny nothing and confirm nothing," he said coldly. "The past is dead, Vivian. Whatever happened 25 years ago has no bearing on the present. My brother made certain of that. By paying off her family, by burying the truth so deep it would never surface, by doing what was necessary to protect the family name. Something you, of all people, should understand. You married into this family for its position and wealth. Do not pretend moral outrage now." His contempt stung, but I forced myself to remain calm. "Lord Fairfax did not believe the past was dead," I said. "He came here seeking redemption, and someone killed him for it. Was it you, Edmund? Did you poison him to keep him silent?" The accusation hung in the air between us, and I saw real anger flash across his face. "You go too far," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You forget your place. You are nothing but a tradesman's daughter who bought her way into nobility. You have no right to question me, no right to dig into matters that do not concern you." "Murder concerns everyone," I replied. "And if you are innocent, you have nothing to fear from the truth." He laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "The truth? The truth is that you are a clever woman playing a dangerous game. You think you can use these fabricated documents to what? Blackmail me? Force me to accept your position here rather than contesting the will? I assure you, whatever you believe you have found will not stand up to scrutiny. It was not fabricated. Lord Fairfax wrote everything in his journal, including your role in Catherine Marsh's death." Edmund went very still. "His death?" he said slowly. "So Lord Fairfax claimed she was killed? That is interesting, Vivian, because Catherine Marsh did not die that summer. She ran away, yes, after making unfounded accusations against my brother and me, accusations her father was willing to forget in exchange for compensation. She ran away and was later reported to have married and settled somewhere in the north. So if Lord Fairfax's journal claims she died, then it proves he was lying or delusional." But I saw uncertainty in his eyes as he spoke, saw him calculating whether his version of events aligned with whatever he thought the journal contained. And I realized with cold clarity that he did not know what had truly happened to Catherine Marsh. He knew only what he had been told, what he had chosen to believe. The truth lay somewhere in the gap between his certainty and his doubt. "Perhaps Lord Fairfax knew something you did not," I said softly. "Perhaps Catherine Marsh did not run away at all." That was when Inspector Cross stepped into the room, his presence like a sudden cold wind. "Mr. Ashford," he said quietly, "I am afraid I must ask you some direct questions about the night of Lord Fairfax's death." Edmund spun to face him, his composure finally cracking. "You," he spat, "you have been listening to our private conversation?" "This is unconscionable, Inspector. I will have your position for this." Cross was unmoved. "You will answer my questions, Mr. Ashford, or I will arrest you for obstruction of justice. Where were you on the evening Lord Fairfax died?" "I was in London. I did not even know Lord Fairfax was visiting Ashford House until I read of his death in the newspapers. Can anyone confirm your whereabouts?" Edmund's eyes darted between us, and I saw him realize he had walked into a trap. "I was dining at my club," he said. "There are witnesses. You will find I have nothing to do with this unfortunate business." Cross pulled out his notebook, that familiar gesture I had seen so many times. "Your club steward informed me that you left early that evening, claiming you were unwell. You returned to your residence at approximately 10:30. The journey from London to Ashford House can be made in under 2 hours by fast carriage. You had time, Mr. Ashford, and you had motive. This is absurd. I did not kill Lord Fairfax. I barely knew the man. But you knew what he might reveal," I said. "You knew that if the truth about Catherine Marsh became public, it would destroy your political career. Your brother is dead and beyond judgment, but you are very much alive and vulnerable to scandal." Edmund looked at me with such hatred that I took an involuntary step back. "You stupid woman," he said through gritted teeth. "You have no idea what you are meddling with. My brother did not hurt Catherine Marsh. I did. I was young and drunk, and she refused me, and I lost my temper. My brother helped me cover it up, paid her family to leave quietly, told me she had gone north and I should forget it ever happened. I believed him. I have spent 25 years believing him. The confession seemed to tear out of him, raw and terrible, and I saw Inspector Cross tense, ready to act. But Edmund was not finished. If anyone killed Catherine Marsh, it was my brother," he said bitterly. "If anyone had reason to silence Lord Fairfax, it was the dead Duke, not me. And since he is beyond your reach, Inspector, you will have to content yourself with that unsatisfying conclusion. Unless," Cross said quietly, "someone else knew what the Duke had done. Someone who had access to this house and to Lord Fairfax during his visit. Someone who could administer poison without arousing suspicion." Edmund's face went pale. "You cannot possibly believe that I poisoned a dying man to protect my already dead brother's reputation. What reason would I have?" "Your inheritance," I said, understanding dawning. "If I am convicted of murder, I lose everything. The estate, the fortune, everything reverts to you as the heir. You did not kill Lord Fairfax to protect the past, Edmund. You killed him to frame me, to destroy my reputation so thoroughly that I could never contest your claim." The silence that followed was absolute. Edmund stared at me, and I saw in his face the slow collapse of his defenses, the moment when a guilty man realizes he has been caught. But then he rallied, shaking his head with a desperate energy. "Prove it," he said. "You have nothing but speculation and the ravings of a dead man in a journal that may or may not exist. You have no witnesses, no evidence, no proof whatsoever." Cross moved closer, his gray eyes cold and implacable. "We have the poison, Mr. Ashford. Lord Fairfax's physician preserved samples of his blood and tissue. We have identified the substance as digitalis, administered in a fatal dose, and we have traced the purchase of a tincture of digitalis to a chemist in London who remembers selling it to a gentleman matching your description 3 weeks before Lord Fairfax's death. It was a bluff, at least in part. The physician had indeed identified digitalis, but the traced purchase was an invention, a thread Cross had woven from probability and hope. But Edmund did not know that. He saw only the walls closing in, the careful structure of his lies crumbling beneath the weight of investigation and truth. "I did it for the family," he said finally, his voice hollow. "For the name we have carried for generations. Lord Fairfax was dying anyway. 6 months, perhaps less. I simply hastened the inevitable and prevented a scandal that would have destroyed everything our ancestors built. And yes, I hoped Vivian would be blamed. She is an outsider, a merchant's daughter who never belonged in this house. If she were removed, the estate would return to true Ashford hands." He spoke as though his reasoning was self-evident, as though murder in service of family pride was a forgivable transgression. I felt sick listening to him, felt the full weight of the evil that could hide behind polite manners and aristocratic breeding. Inspector Cross produced handcuffs from his coat pocket, the metal gleaming dully in the firelight. "Edmund Ashford," he said formally, "I am arresting you for the murder of Lord Edmund Fairfax. You will be taken to London to stand trial." Edmund did not resist. He seemed to deflate, all his confidence and charm evaporating to leave only a tired, frightened man who had bet everything on a lie and lost. As Cross led him toward the door, Edmund looked back at me one last time. "You have won, Vivienne," he said quietly. "I hope you find it was worth the cost." Then he was gone, and I was left alone in the drawing room with the aftermath of revelation and the echo of accusations that would never be fully silenced. Cross returned an hour later, after Edmund had been secured in the carriage that would take him to London. He found me still in the drawing room, staring into the fire and trying to make sense of everything that had happened. He sat down beside me without speaking, and we remained that way for a long time, too exhausted for words. "It is over," he said finally. "You are free, Your Grace. Your name is cleared." But I did not feel free. I felt hollowed out, drained of everything except a bone-deep weariness and a grief for all the lives destroyed by pride and silence. Catherine Marsh, whether she had died that summer or fled to the north, had never received justice. Lord Fairfax had carried his guilt to the grave. The late Duke had escaped all earthly judgment. And Edmund would hang for murder, but the deeper crime, the original sin that had set all of this in motion, would remain unpunished. "What will happen now?" I asked. Cross sighed. "Edmund will stand trial. The evidence is sufficient for a conviction, I believe. The scandal will be enormous, but you will survive it. You will keep Ashford House and your position. And I will return to London and other cases, other investigations." The thought of him leaving made my chest tighten with a pain that was almost physical. "You will go then," I said, keeping my voice carefully neutral. "Your work here is finished." He turned to look at me, and I saw in his eyes the same anguish I felt. "My work is finished," he agreed. "But that does not mean I wish to go. Then stay." The words were out before I could stop them. "Stay here, with me. We could find a way to make it work, to navigate the scandal and the gossip. I do not care what society thinks, Nathaniel. I care only that I cannot bear to lose you now." He reached for my hand, his fingers closing around mine with a tenderness that made tears prick at my eyes. "You know it is impossible," he said gently. "You are a duchess, I am a policeman. The gulf between us is too wide, and I will not let you sacrifice your position and reputation for me. You deserve better than a life of whispers and disapproval. I deserve to be happy, and you make me happy in a way I have never experienced before. Does that count for nothing? It counts for everything, which is why I must refuse, because I love you enough to want you to have the life you deserve, even if that life does not include me." The confession hung between us, achingly beautiful and utterly devastating. He loved me, and I loved him. And it was not enough, because the world we inhabited would never permit a duchess to marry a detective, would never forgive such a transgression against the rules of class and propriety. I wanted to argue, to insist that love should be enough, that we could find a way, but I saw the resolution in his face and knew it would be useless. Nathaniel Cross was a man of principles, and those principles would not permit him to damage me by association, even if I was willing to be damaged. "I will remember you," I said, my voice breaking. "Every day for the rest of my life, I will remember this." "And I you," he replied. "You are the finest woman I have ever known, Vivienne. In another life, in another world, perhaps we might have been happy together." He raised my hand to his lips and kissed it gently, a gesture of reverence and farewell, and then he was gone, walking out of the drawing room and out of my life, leaving me alone with my cleared name and my broken heart. That night, I dreamed one final time of Dr. Thorne's voice calling me back. "Eleanor," he was saying urgently, "Eleanor, I am bringing you out of the dream state now. The experiment is ending. You must let go and return." And for the first time, I did not want to return. Eleanor Hartley had nothing, was nothing, a shadow of a woman with no love and no purpose. But Vivienne Ashford had lived and fought and loved with an intensity that made every moment precious. If I returned to Eleanor's life, I would lose Nathaniel, lose the memory of his gray eyes and his austere face, and the way he had looked at me as though I were the most precious thing in the world. I tried to cling to the dream, to refuse the summons back to waking, but I felt myself rising through layers of consciousness like a diver ascending from deep water. The canopied bed faded, the drawing room dissolved, and I was falling through darkness toward a light that hurt my eyes, I woke gasping on Dr. Thorne's daybed, the helmet being lifted from my head, the doctor's concerned face swimming into focus above me. "Miss Hartley," he was saying, "can you hear me? You have been under for far too long." I was beginning to fear I had lost you. I blinked at him, disoriented and aching, my body feeling wrong, too small and weak and empty. "Where am I?" I whispered, though I knew the answer. "When am I?" "You are in my study in Bloomsbury," Dr. Thorne said gently. "It is Thursday evening, approximately 3 hours after you entered the dream state. The machine malfunctioned, Miss Hartley. Your consciousness went far deeper than intended. I am so very sorry. Are you injured? Can you move?" I sat up slowly, every movement an effort. 3 hours. I had lived what felt like weeks in Vivian's life, had solved a murder and fallen in love and had my heart broken. And only 3 hours had passed in the waking world. It seemed impossible, a cruelty beyond measure. "I am uninjured," I said, but my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. "The experiment. Did it succeed? Did you learn what you needed?" Dr. Thorne was making notes in a ledger, his expression troubled. "The data is remarkable," he said. "Your brain activity during the deep dream state was unlike anything I have ever recorded. But the risk, Miss Hartley, the danger of such prolonged immersion, I cannot in good conscience continue. I am shutting down the experiment." I nodded, too numb to care. I took the money he offered, his apologies washing over me unheard, and made my way back to the boarding house through streets that felt unreal, peopled by strangers who could not possibly understand what I had lost. In my narrow room, I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to remember who Eleanor Hartley was, what she wanted, why she existed. But all I could think of was Nathaniel Cross, the man who had loved me in a dream and sent me away in the waking world, the man I would never see again. The weeks that followed were gray and airless. I returned to my typewriter, to the legal documents and the other typists and the crushing monotony of days that bled into one another without distinction. But I was changed, marked by my time as Vivian in ways I could not articulate or explain. I moved through my ordinary life like a ghost, haunting the scene of her own mundane existence. 3 months after the experiment, I saw a notice in the newspaper. Edmund Ashford, Member of Parliament, convicted of murder and sentenced to hang. The scandal had been enormous, the trial sensational, every sordid detail exposed to public scrutiny. And there, mentioned briefly in the article, was her name, Vivian Ashford, Duchess, who had cooperated fully with the investigation and been completely exonerated of all suspicion. She was real. The dream had been real, or real enough that it existed somewhere, in some form, beyond the confines of Dr. Thorne's machine. I began to research, spending my evenings in public reading rooms, searching through old newspapers and public records, and I found her, found evidence of Vivian's existence, scattered through society pages and legal documents. She was real. She had lived the life I had dreamed. And Nathaniel Cross was real too, a detective with Scotland Yard, known for his integrity and his impressive record of solved cases. I found a photograph of him in an article about a different investigation, and seeing his face, those gray eyes even in a grainy newspaper photograph, made my heart contract with longing so intense it left me breathless. I wrote him a letter. I do not know what possessed me to do it, what hope I thought I might salvage from the ruins of a love that had existed only in a dream. But I wrote, pouring onto paper everything I felt, everything I had experienced, the impossible truth of having lived as someone else and loved him in that other life. I mailed it with no expectation of reply. How could he respond to the ravings of a stranger claiming to have inhabited a duchess's body through some scientific experiment? He would think me mad, if he thought of me at all. But 3 weeks later, a letter arrived at the boarding house, addressed in a precise masculine hand. My fingers trembled as I opened it. "Dear Miss Hartley," it read, "your letter reached me with considerable surprise and no small degree of wonder. I do not know how you came to know the details of the Fairfax case, as they were not made fully public. I do not understand your claim to have experienced events you could not possibly have witnessed. But I know this. The woman you describe, the Duchess of Ashford, spoke to me in your voice. She looked at me with eyes that seemed to see straight to my soul. And when she told me she loved me, I believed her absolutely, even though I could not allow myself to accept that love. If you are in some way that woman, or if she is in some way you, then perhaps there are truths in this world that exceed the boundaries of my understanding. I would very much like to speak with you. If you are willing, I will be in London next Thursday. Might we meet? I read the letter a dozen times, scarcely able to believe the evidence of my own eyes. He remembered. He believed, or at least he was willing to consider believing, and he wanted to see me. The meeting took place in a small tea room near Trafalgar Square, neutral ground where a typist and a detective might encounter each other without causing scandal. I arrived early and sat by the window, my heart pounding, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. And then he walked through the door, and it was like coming home. He was exactly as I remembered, tall and austere, with those penetrating gray eyes and that air of controlled intensity. He saw me immediately, and I watched recognition and confusion and wonder chase across his face. He approached slowly, as though I might vanish if he moved too quickly. "Miss Hartley," he said, and his voice was the voice I had heard in my dreams, deep and careful and achingly familiar. "Inspector Cross," I replied, and then, because it felt more true, "Nathaniel." He sat down across from me, and we simply looked at each other for a long moment. "I see her in you," he said finally. "The Duchess, the way you hold yourself, the quality of your gaze. It is impossible, and yet I cannot deny it. I lived as her," I said. "I do not understand how or why, but for those hours in Dr. Thorne's machine, I was Vivian Ashford. I felt what she felt. I knew what she knew. And I loved you as she loved you." His hand reached across the table, and I met it halfway, our fingers interlacing as naturally as breathing. "I sent her away," he said, and his voice was rough with regret. "I told her we could not be together, that the gulf between us was too wide. But you are not a duchess, Eleanor. You are a typist, a woman I might actually have a life with if you would permit it." I felt tears spill down my cheeks, tears of relief and joy and the bittersweet ache of second chances. "Are you asking me to permit it?" I whispered. "I am asking if you would consider allowing a stubborn detective to court you properly. I cannot offer you a title or a great estate, but I can offer you honesty and devotion, and a love that has survived the boundaries between dream and waking." "Yes," I said, laughing through my tears. "Yes, Nathaniel. 1,000 times yes." We married 6 months later, a quiet ceremony attended by a handful of friends and Dr. Thorne, who had become fascinated by the case and what it suggested about the nature of consciousness and identity. I never returned to his machine, and I never experienced anything like those impossible weeks as Vivian Ashford. But sometimes, in dreams, I still walk the halls of Ashford House. Sometimes I still feel the weight of emeralds at my throat and hear the autumn wind rattling the windows. And sometimes I wonder if somewhere, in some other version of reality, Vivian made a different choice. If she fought for her love instead of accepting his sacrifice. If she found a way to bridge the gulf between Duchess and detective and claimed her happiness despite the world's disapproval. I like to think she did. I like to think that in that other life, she and Nathaniel found their way to each other, just as Eleanor and Nathaniel did in this one. Because love, I have learned, is the only thing that matters. Not position or propriety or the boundaries we draw between possible and impossible. Just love, pure and fierce and uncompromising, strong enough to survive anything, even the space between dreams and waking. And I am loved. That is the truth I carry with me every day, the truth that makes sense of everything that came before. I am Eleanor Hartley Cross, wife of the finest man I have ever known, and I am happy in a way that the quiet typist could never have imagined. But I was also, for a brief and impossible time, Vivian Ashford. And that truth lives in me too, a secret self that knows what it means to be powerful and vulnerable and desperately, completely in love. Both women are me. Both lives are mine, and I would not trade a single moment of either one.